My name is Nick. I'm 27, and I've spent most of my life feeling like the invisible member of my own family. Growing up, my parents and sister had this rhythm, a pattern where my sister, Rachel, got away with everything, and I somehow ended up being the one to take the blame for minor slip-ups or even things that weren't my fault. Mom never exactly sided with her, but she had this weird way of staying quiet, like she thought witnessing the injustice was the same as doing something about it. Rachel's always been the kind of person who could make a room revolve around her, who could turn a slight inconvenience into a personal tragedy and somehow make herself the hero at the same time. And me? I was just there, absorbing the chaos, trying not to make waves. It's funny how the little things pile up over time until one day they're no longer small. That's exactly where I was last weekend, sitting at the dining table with Mom and Rachel after a relatively uneventful dinner that my sister had helped make, although her idea of helping mostly involved delegating the actual work to me. I'm not exaggerating when I say she turned every single moment into a performance. She criticized the way I chopped vegetables, the way I set the plates, even the way I poured the water. Mom just sat there, silent, twirling her fork like she didn't want to be part of any argument. The first spark of real tension that night wasn't even about food. Rachel had been borrowing my laptop earlier in the week without asking and had somehow managed to delete a project I'd been working on for months. Not on purpose. Or at least, that's what she claimed, but she didn't think to tell me, either. When I confronted her about it, she rolled her eyes, threw her hands up, and said, "You always make everything into a huge deal. Stop acting like the world revolves around you." Classic. The gaslighting, the manipulation, it had been the family pattern since I could remember. But that night, something inside me snapped. I was done silently swallowing my frustration, done being the punching bag, the convenient scapegoat. I told her calmly, "Rachel, I'm not acting. This is serious. You deleted my work, and it's not acceptable. I need you to acknowledge that and apologize." She leaned back in her chair, smirking like she had already won the argument just by existing. "Oh, please. You always make yourself the victim. You're impossible." That line, her favorite line, was like nails on a chalkboard at this point. I could feel my blood pressure rising, and something I hadn't done in a long time bubbled up inside me. I wanted her to face the truth, and I wanted Mom to finally witness it. I took a deep breath and reached into my pocket. I had been planning this quietly for weeks, not in some elaborate revenge plot, but in a way that was undeniable. I pulled out my phone, tapped a few times, and set it on the table. "Tell the truth about what you did or leave right now," I said, keeping my voice steady. My heart was racing, and I could see Rachel's smirk falter just a fraction. Mom's fork stopped midair. Silence fell, thick and heavy, the kind that makes every second feel like an hour. I hit play. Seconds later, Rachel's voice filled the room. It wasn't the mockery or excuses I had heard before. It was her, admitting things she had always denied, saying things she'd never own up to in front of anyone, let alone Mom. The moment was electric. I could see Rachel's face drain of color, her usual confidence crumbling as she realized she couldn't talk her way out of this one. Mom, finally, looked up, and for the first time in years, I felt her actually seeing me, not as the background character in Rachel's story, but as a person who had been pushed around for too long. I could feel the tension radiating off Rachel in waves. She opened her mouth to interrupt, probably thinking she could charm or gaslight her way out like usual. But the recording kept playing, cutting her off. Every denial, every accusation she had thrown at me over the years was now exposed for what it was. And yet, she didn't yell, didn't storm off, at least, not immediately. She just froze, eyes darting between me and Mom, the silence in the room stretching into a painful, almost unbearable length. That night, as I watched her struggle to regain control, I realized something. This wasn't just about the laptop or that project. It was about years of frustration, of being minimized, of being told I was too sensitive or too dramatic whenever I stood up for myself. It was about finally having the evidence, the proof, the undeniable moment where Rachel's facade cracked, even if just slightly. And I could feel, deep down, that this was just the beginning. The scales were finally tipping, and I wasn't going to let this moment slip away. After that night, the atmosphere in our house shifted, though not in a way that felt immediately satisfying. There wasn't an instant confrontation or dramatic shouting match, the kind you see in movies, but a slow, simmering tension that made every interaction feel charged, fragile, like the house itself was holding its breath. Rachel avoided me as much as she could, moving through rooms silently, her eyes always darting in my direction before snapping away. Mom, as usual, didn't intervene. She still spoke to both of us politely, but there was a distance in her gaze that hadn't been there before, like she was processing something, or maybe just waiting for me to overreact. I spent most of the next few days quietly observing. I didn't need to chase Rachel down or argue. I let her do the heavy lifting of trying to reassert her control. And true to form, she did not disappoint. At first, it was small things. She'd interrupt me during family meals, claiming to correct something I said, even when I was stating facts. She would accidentally take the things I needed in the kitchen for her projects or assignments, leaving me scrambling. I would catch her smirking at me from across the room as if the previous confrontation had never happened, as if the recording hadn't exposed her. Mom, again, watched quietly. It was maddening, like living in a house where the walls themselves were siding with her. The next real spark came over a trivial matter that somehow became monumental in Rachel's mind. I had reserved a time slot at the local gym, a rare window I could take for myself since I was training for a 10K race. Rachel needed to go at the exact same time, claiming her workout was more important because she was doing it for a school project, or so she said. When I refused to give up my time, she launched into a tirade about how selfish I was, how I always put myself first, and how Mom had taught me wrong by allowing me to hog opportunities. She said it all with this venomous calm, the kind of tone that makes you freeze because it feels like she's rewriting history while you're supposed to nod in agreement. I stood there, fists clenched, trying not to react, because I knew that was exactly what she wanted, a reaction I could later twist against me. Mom finally said something that day, though it wasn't helpful. "Nick, maybe you can compromise," she suggested, her voice soft but heavy with a kind of passive disapproval that made my stomach twist. Compromise? After everything, compromise now felt like conceding again. But I said nothing, only nodded, quietly seething. I didn't give up my gym slot. Rachel stomped off, muttering under her breath about how I never considered anyone but myself. It didn't stop there. Over the next week, she started escalating more aggressively. She would borrow things of mine and then deny ever touching them. She'd mock my interests openly, calling them childish or pointless, especially in front of Mom. The more she did it, the more Mom stayed silent. The more I felt the unfairness stacking like bricks on my chest. Every small slight felt amplified because of everything that had happened that night with the recording. It should have been a turning point, a moment of accountability, but instead, it seemed like it had only angered her and made her more cunning. Then came the incident that changed everything. I don't even know how to fully describe it without feeling a spike of anger all over again. It was Saturday morning. I had a job interview for a position I'd been working toward for months, a role that would finally give me some independence and the financial freedom I'd been craving. I'd left my folder with my resume and references on my desk, ready to take it with me. I went to make a cup of coffee, came back, and the folder was gone. I didn't panic at first. I tried to rationalize. Maybe I had moved it. Maybe it had fallen behind the desk. But deep down, I knew better. I went into the living room and found Rachel, casually scrolling her phone, the folder neatly tucked under her arm. She looked up at me with this smug expression, like she was catching me at something embarrassing. "Looking for this?" she asked sweetly, her voice dripping with mock innocence. My stomach dropped, and I could feel my pulse spike. "Rachel, give that back. I need it," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, but there was a tremor I couldn't hide. "Oh, this?" she laughed, tossing it slightly in the air before catching it again. "You don't even need it today. I'm doing you a favor. Don't thank me, please." Her smirk was infuriating. Mom watched from the corner, as always, quietly, and I could feel my jaw tighten. "This isn't funny. This is serious. I have an interview, and you're jeopardizing it," I said, stepping closer, trying to assert control without exploding. "You're always so dramatic," she said, shrugging as if my very life depended on her whims. "I mean, come on, Nick, it's just a folder. Don't act like I ruined your whole career." Her words were poisonous. And in that moment, something broke in me. I realized that this wasn't just Rachel being a spoiled sister. This was a pattern of entitlement, manipulation, and cruelty that had been allowed to fester because Mom refused to intervene. I was done being the reasonable one while she threw my life and feelings under the bus. I reached for the folder, but she yanked it back just out of reach, giggling. I could feel my frustration boiling into something I couldn't ignore. My hands shook, my chest tightened, and I could sense that if I let this moment pass without a response, she would continue believing she could control everything. I thought back to the recording, the proof of all her lies, her manipulation, her endless excuses. That night had been a small victory, but now I knew I needed more than a recording. I needed a way to make sure she couldn't keep doing this, couldn't keep undermining me. Before I could act, she leaned back on the couch, still holding the folder, and whispered something that made my blood run cold. "You'll never get ahead while you keep playing by the rules, Nick. You're too predictable, too weak. Maybe that's why Mom always protects me and lets me do whatever I want." Her words weren't just cruel. They were an accusation, a judgment, and a warning all at once. And for the first time, I saw clearly that Mom's silence wasn't just neutrality. It was tacit approval. It was enabling. It was the final straw. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to process what I had just heard. My mind raced with possibilities. Could I confront both of them at once? Could I finally break through to Mom, make her see what I had been enduring for years? Or was this the moment I had to start protecting myself in ways I hadn't yet considered? The next few hours were a blur of suppressed anger, pacing, and planning. I couldn't leave the folder there. I couldn't let her continue thinking she could humiliate me with impunity. I had to find a way to reclaim control without giving her the satisfaction of a full-blown argument, something that would let her manipulate the narrative again. My emotions were tangled: fear, anger, hurt, and estranged, building determination all at once. Finally, I realized the reality of my situation. This wasn't just a fight over a folder or a single interview. This was the culmination of years of favoritism, gaslighting, and manipulation. Rachel had always had the upper hand, and Mom's quiet complicity had reinforced it. But now, I had a chance to shift the balance, to create a moment where the truth couldn't be denied, where I could finally assert myself in a way that couldn't be twisted, lied about, or erased. And just as I was planning my next move, Rachel did something so unexpected, so shocking, that it nearly knocked me off my feet. She didn't just hold the folder out of my reach. She opened it, pulled out my resume, and ripped it in half. Not just a quick tear, but a deliberate, almost ceremonial destruction, crumpling the pages into tiny pieces before letting them fall to the floor like confetti. I froze. My mouth went dry. The room seemed to tilt. Mom gasped softly, but she still didn't intervene. Rachel looked at me with that same smug, unflinching expression. "Guess you're not getting that job now, Nick. Maybe you should have learned sooner that you can't always win." In that moment, everything inside me screamed. All the years of quiet endurance, all the times I swallowed my pride to keep the peace, all the little humiliations and subtle betrayals, they coalesced into one sharp, undeniable reality. Things had to change, and I had to make sure this time there would be no doubt about who was in control. After Rachel tore my resume apart, the house felt smaller, heavier, like the walls themselves were pressing in, suffocating me. I sat on my bed for what felt like hours, staring at the crumpled scraps on the floor and trying to breathe without letting my panic show. I'd been so close to stepping into something that could change my life, and in a single, calculated moment, she'd stolen it from me. It wasn't just an attack on a piece of paper. It was an attack on my ability to succeed, on my independence, on the very idea that I could carve a life separate from the family dynamic that had kept me small for years. I wanted to shout. I wanted to throw things. I wanted to make her feel even a fraction of the humiliation and anger I was swallowing whole. But I didn't. I knew from years of experience that any immediate reaction would only feed her, only prove her right in her twisted little narrative that I was weak, emotional, and incapable of standing up for myself without losing control. So instead, I did the hardest thing. I left. Not dramatically, not in some grand gesture, just quietly slipping out of the house, closing the door behind me, and letting the world outside swallow me up. The streets were cold, the wind biting, and for a moment, I let myself feel defeated. I walked for hours, circling neighborhoods, running through every scenario in my head. How had I let it get this far? How had I let her, or Mom, make me feel powerless? I realized something crucial in that walk. The problem wasn't just Rachel. It was me. I had spent years bending to the whims of a person who thrived on control, quietly accepting Mom's neutrality, thinking it was safer to keep the peace than to assert my own boundaries. And now, here I was, raw and exposed, realizing that if I didn't make a change, nothing would ever be different. I hit rock bottom that night. I sat on a park bench, hunched over, shivering despite my jacket, staring at my phone, thinking of all the doors Rachel had closed for me with one flick of her hand. But amid the despair, a small, stubborn spark ignited. If Rachel wanted to play games, I could play them too, but smarter, quieter, more strategically. I couldn't control her actions, and I couldn't force Mom to act differently, but I could control myself. I could build a life outside of their approval, outside of their manipulation, and for the first time in years, I felt a surge of clarity. The first step was practical. I found a small cafe with free Wi-Fi and a quiet corner. I started reconstructing my resume, this time meticulously, going over every detail to make it stronger, sharper. I realized that Rachel's destruction had been a setback, but not a permanent one. The world outside my house didn't care about the scraps of paper or the petty power plays. Opportunities existed regardless of her interference, but only if I was proactive. I stayed at the cafe late into the night, rewriting cover letters, researching companies, and mapping out a plan that was far more comprehensive than the original. I wasn't just rebuilding my resume. I was rebuilding my confidence, brick by brick. The next morning, I took it a step further. I enrolled in a few online courses related to my field, things I'd been hesitant to commit to because of time, money, or self-doubt. Every module I completed felt like a small victory, like reclaiming a piece of the self-esteem Rachel had tried to crush. I made spreadsheets, set goals, tracked progress, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of control over my life. No one in my family had a say in this process. This was mine. Rachel, of course, noticed the shift. She started trying to provoke me in subtle ways, commenting on my routines, mocking the time I spent at the cafe, making snide remarks about how busy you are pretending to be productive. But her attempts didn't sting like they used to. I had learned to detach, to let her words wash over me without giving them weight. Mom still stayed quiet, glancing between us, but I no longer sought her approval or feared her judgment. The silence that had once felt suffocating now felt neutral, almost liberating. Over the next few weeks, I began taking concrete steps to reclaim my independence. I applied to multiple jobs, networked with professionals in my field, and quietly started a small side project that I'd been dreaming about for years, a freelance consulting service I could run online. Each email I sent, each client I secured, each milestone I hit felt like a small act of rebellion, a way of proving to myself that my worth wasn't tied to Rachel's approval or Mom's complicity. It was mine and mine alone. But just as I began to feel the first real taste of progress, the tension at home escalated in ways I hadn't anticipated. Rachel, sensing my growing independence, began to lash out more aggressively. It started with passive-aggressive comments about wasting my time, with online courses, escalated to stealing documents and personal items from my room, and culminated in moments of outright sabotage. One morning, I discovered that she had unplugged my laptop while I was asleep, deleting unsaved drafts I had been working on for weeks. Another time, she borrowed a notebook filled with project ideas and left it in the rain, soaking it completely. Each incident was calculated, precise, and cruel, designed to make me feel powerless and question my own ability to succeed outside her sphere. What surprised me most, though, was Mom. She didn't intervene. She didn't scold Rachel. She didn't offer comfort. Instead, she would sigh, shake her head, and mutter something like, "Nick, you should have known better," or "Rachel isn't intentionally trying to hurt you." Those words were like acid on my determination, but rather than crushing me, they reinforced something I'd known all along. I could no longer rely on anyone in my family to validate me. I had to build my own foundation. By the end of that month, I had reached a turning point. I had secured a small contract through my freelance consulting, enough to give me a modest income, and I had several job interviews lined up, including one at a company I'd admired for years. The sense of accomplishment was intoxicating, Not because I was rubbing it in Rachel's face, but because I finally felt like I was standing on my own 2 feet. I had become my own advocate, my own protector, and my own source of validation. However, the house remained a battlefield. Rachel's provocations continued, more desperate and reckless with each passing day. She started leaving passive-aggressive notes on my desk, accidentally spilling drinks on my workspace, and even trying to manipulate Mom into restricting my movements, framing me as selfish or unreasonable. Each attempt to undermine me was a reminder that my journey wasn't going to be easy, that the fight for respect and autonomy wouldn't be won overnight. One evening, I returned from a long day of interviews and work, only to find Rachel sitting in the living room, phone in hand, recording me again. I didn't know what she planned, but the look on her face told me it wasn't innocent. "Why do you always have to act so serious?" she asked, feigning concern. "Can't you just relax for once?" I didn't answer. I had learned that silence could be more powerful than words. Instead, I walked past her, my mind already racing through scenarios, strategies, and contingencies. Every interaction, every glance, every subtle manipulation she attempted was now data, fuel for the plan I was quietly building. I was no longer reactive. I was strategic. I was calm, calculated, and increasingly confident in my ability to shift the balance without losing control. By the time I went to bed that night, the sense of tension in the house had transformed into something I could almost measure, a taut line stretched between us, vibrating with potential energy. Rachel had thrown everything at me, trying to knock me down, but I had survived. I had grown stronger, sharper, and more resilient in ways I hadn't known I could. And for the first time in my life, I realized that the person I had to defeat wasn't just Rachel. It was the pattern itself, the dynamic that had kept me small for so long. I knew the next steps had to be precise. I needed leverage, timing, and patience. I needed to set the stage so that when I finally acted, there would be no ambiguity, no room for her lies or manipulations to take hold. And deep down, I felt a strange exhilaration. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice, about reclaiming my life, and about proving, finally, that I was capable of standing tall no matter how toxic the environment around me became. As I lay in bed that night, planning, calculating, and silently celebrating the small victories of the day, I realized something crucial. The fall had been necessary. Hitting rock bottom had stripped away all illusions, all reliance on anyone but myself, and in its place, I had begun to rise, not with anger, but with clarity, purpose, and determination. And for the first time, I felt like I was the one holding the reins, the one controlling the narrative, and the one who would decide how the next chapter unfolded. The first step in reclaiming control was understanding the battlefield. I couldn't just rush into confrontation or retaliation. It would play into Rachel's hands. She thrived on chaos, on emotional reactions, on moments where she could twist the story to make herself the victim and me the unreasonable one. No, this had to be strategic, quiet, calculated. I had to know the terrain, the players, and the patterns before I made my move. And now, with my confidence rebuilt and my own successes beginning to take shape, I was in the perfect position to do just that. I started by observing Rachel more closely than ever before. Every morning, she had the same routines. Coffee at exactly 7:15, scrolling through her phone while Mom read the newspaper, then lingering near the kitchen counter to see what I was doing. Her expression a careful mix of casual curiosity and subtle judgment. I noticed how she reacted when she thought I wasn't looking, rolling her eyes, smirking, whispering comments to Mom, or subtly sabotaging small things around me. Her ego was massive, but it was predictable. That predictability became my first advantage. Mom, on the other hand, was still frustratingly neutral. She'd glance at Rachel, then at me, then look away, often saying something like, "I don't want to get involved in your squabbles." But I realized that neutrality wasn't indifference. It was a blind spot I could exploit. Mom had always valued appearances and politeness, and she hated conflict that escalated beyond what she could control. So if I could engineer situations where Rachel's behavior became undeniable to anyone watching, Mom would either be forced to act or be exposed herself as complicit. That gave me leverage. I began documenting everything. Every small slight, every passive-aggressive remark, every act of sabotage. I created a private folder on my cloud account, labeled meticulously by date and event, with screenshots, photos, and even a few secret recordings of conversations where Rachel tried to manipulate or gaslight me. It felt almost therapeutic, like each piece of evidence I collected was a brick being laid in the foundation of the plan that would ultimately shift the balance. The more I documented, the more patterns emerged, and the more I realized just how methodical Rachel really was. Every accident had a traceable thread, a timing that revealed intent. I was starting to see the architecture of her cruelty, and it was exhilarating. Next, I worked on fortifying my own position. The freelance consulting work was gaining traction, and I secured a few additional clients who were reliable and professional. I also lined up a few more interviews in fields I'd only dreamed of entering, making sure that I had a financial buffer and career momentum independent of the house I'd been trapped in. Every success I achieved quietly chipped away at Rachel's perceived control over me. It wasn't just symbolic. My growing independence meant she couldn't sabotage me without consequences I controlled. But the real game changer came when I realized I had allies I hadn't acknowledged before. One of my clients was a longtime friend of the family, someone who'd always respected me and noticed Rachel's manipulations. Another was a colleague from an online course who had firsthand experience with entitlement and toxicity in personal relationships. Both were willing to offer advice and, more importantly, subtle assistance without interfering directly. The realization was liberating. I didn't have to face Rachel alone. I just had to maneuver carefully so that my moves appeared organic rather than orchestrated. With the groundwork laid, I began planting seeds for confrontation. These weren't dramatic gestures or threats. They were subtle, strategic nudges designed to provoke predictable reactions from Rachel. I started leaving my projects in plain sight, making sure she knew I had rebuilt them stronger than before. I mentioned upcoming interviews casually, letting her overhear but not giving her direct access. I documented every small attempt she made to undermine me, knowing that eventually, the cumulative evidence would be undeniable. I also began exploiting her ego. Rachel had always thrived on the idea that she was cleverer than everyone else, that she could outsmart and manipulate without consequence. I played into this, pretending to be caught off guard, letting her think she had the upper hand, while quietly setting up situations where her own actions would expose her. I let her believe she could continue sabotaging me, confident that I was aware and ready, and that any misstep on her part would be magnified by the careful documentation I'd amassed. One particularly useful tactic was leveraging Mom's sense of decorum. Mom hated confrontations that looked messy or public. I started staging small interactions in her presence, subtle enough that she couldn't immediately intervene, but clear enough that she would notice Rachel's behavior. Rachel's passive aggressiveness became more pronounced when she thought Mom was watching, giving me invaluable insight into how she behaved under pressure. I started predicting her reactions with frightening accuracy, planning the right moves to push her further without tipping her off that she was being cornered. At the same time, I quietly enhanced my own personal space. I secured my workspace, backed up all files in multiple locations, and even implemented small security measures to prevent Rachel from accessing my devices. Each precaution wasn't just practical, it was psychological. It reinforced to me that I was no longer vulnerable in the same way, that my life, my success, and my dignity were no longer dependent on her whims. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in the house became almost tangible. Rachel's behavior grew increasingly reckless, a combination of frustration and fear at the subtle but undeniable shift in power. She'd try to provoke arguments, leave accusatory notes, or attempt minor sabotage, but each attempt only reinforced my resolve and added to the growing dossier of evidence. Mom watched, quietly tense, and I could sense that the imbalance was becoming more obvious even to her. She still didn't intervene directly, but I noticed small cracks, hesitations in her speech, tighter expressions, the way she avoided Rachel's eye when she started to act out. Then, finally, I found the perfect opportunity. It came in the form of a family gathering, an anniversary dinner for one of Mom's friends, a formal but intimate event with several people who respected me and had observed Rachel's manipulations over the years. The setting was ideal, public enough that Rachel's behavior could be seen, intimate enough that I could control the narrative and ensure that the right people noticed the truth. I began planning carefully, envisioning exactly how each interaction would unfold, predicting Rachel's reactions, and laying contingencies for Mom's likely responses. I spent nights rehearsing scenarios in my head, anticipating every possible angle. Every word Rachel might say, every gesture she might make, every attempt to deflect or manipulate. Each was cataloged and countered with a planned response. I wasn't just preparing to defend myself. I was preparing to orchestrate a situation where the truth would be undeniable, where the scales would finally tip, and where Rachel's manipulations would collapse under the weight of evidence, observation, and precision. By the time the day arrived, I felt calm, focused, and ready. The months of planning, rebuilding, and quiet strategy had culminated in a moment where I would finally seize control. I knew the night could be volatile. Rachel would likely sense the shift, act out, or try to sabotage the plan. Mom might still hesitate, but I had built contingencies, allies, and momentum that I could rely on. As I dressed for the evening, checking my notes and quietly reviewing the evidence I had compiled, I felt a strange mixture of excitement and dread. This was the point of no return. Everything I had done over the past few months, the rebuilding, the observation, the strategy, had led to this setup. The next few hours could change the dynamic in our family forever. Rachel would either continue her pattern of entitlement and manipulation, or the cracks in her armor would finally be exposed in a way she couldn't deny, twist, or escape. I took a deep breath, reminded myself of the months of work and quiet victories, and stepped out the door. For the first time in years, I wasn't just reacting to my sister's cruelty. I was directing the narrative, guiding the momentum, and setting the stage for a reckoning. The setup was complete. The pieces were in place. Now, all that remained was to execute and watch everything unfold exactly as planned. The evening of the dinner arrived, and everything felt electric, charged with anticipation. I knew Rachel would be on high alert, her ego bristling at any sign of independence or competence from me. But I also knew the stakes were mine to control. I arrived early, dressed neatly, carrying a subtle folder that contained my evidence. The venue was small, warm, with low lighting and soft chatter, the kind of environment where a single word, a subtle action, or a quiet revelation could carry tremendous weight. I felt my pulse steady, a mixture of nerves and satisfaction. Months of strategy, patience, and rebuilding my life had led to this moment, and there was no turning back. Rachel arrived shortly after, radiant in her usual performative way, laughing at things that weren't particularly funny and already casting glances toward me, trying to gauge how I would react. Mom trailed behind her, polite but tense, scanning the room and occasionally throwing me quick, cautious looks. I could feel the weight of observation from several other guests, all friendly acquaintances who had known our family dynamics for years and who subtly respected me even when Rachel had attempted to dominate every interaction. Everything was in my favor, if I kept my composure. The dinner began smoothly enough, polite chatter flowing, forks clinking, wine poured, and small talk filling the gaps. Rachel, predictably, made several attempts to provoke me. Flippant remarks about my career choices, sly digs at my hobbies, and passive-aggressive comments about how busy I must be trying to catch up with everyone else's success. I kept my reactions measured, letting her words float past like smoke. Each attempt she made only strengthened my confidence, because I knew the real reveal was yet to come. Midway through the meal, I casually pulled the folder from my bag and set it on the table in front of me, sliding it toward Rachel without making a scene. Her expression flickered, confusion and apprehension crossing her face, but she forced a smile and leaned back, pretending curiosity. I let it sit there, calm, confident, and in plain sight. "I think it's time to clear the air," I said quietly, my voice measured but firm, ensuring that several nearby guests caught the statement. "Rachel, everything I've experienced over the past few years, the lies, the sabotage, the manipulation, has been documented. Every action, every word, every attempt to undermine me has been recorded or captured in some way. I think it's time we address it openly." The room went slightly still. Rachel's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of panic she tried to hide behind forced laughter. "Nick, really? Here? In front of everyone?" she asked, her voice tense, betraying the first cracks in her carefully constructed facade. "Yes," I replied calm. "Here, because this isn't just about you and me anymore. It's about the truth being visible to those who have witnessed your behavior over the years. I opened the folder and started methodically laying out the evidence. Screenshots of her manipulative messages, photographs of sabotage projects, recordings of conversations where she tried to gaslight me, and even documentation of small but significant moments she had attempted to deny. Each piece was undeniable, factual, and presented without emotion. Let the evidence speak for itself. Rachel's composure unraveled slowly at first. She tried to interject, saying things like, "You're exaggerating, and that's not what happened." But the documents and recordings left no room for argument. I played a few of the recordings for everyone, including Mom, who now looked stunned, realizing the depth and consistency of Rachel's manipulations. The sounds of Rachel's voice, admitting things she had denied countless times, hung in the air, undeniable and uncompromising. Rachel's panic grew into visible frustration. She slapped her hand down on the table, her face red, her voice rising as she attempted to regain control. "This is ridiculous. You're making this a spectacle," she shouted, but even she knew the damage was done. Several of the guests, familiar with the family's history, exchanged glances that silently acknowledged what they had suspected all along. Rachel's carefully cultivated reputation of charm and wit couldn't survive the weight of truth displayed so methodically and publicly. Mom finally spoke, though hesitantly. "Rachel, I didn't realize." Her voice trailed off, guilt and shock mingling, as she realized that years of quiet complicity had allowed Rachel's behavior to flourish unchecked. "I didn't need her approval. I simply let her acknowledgement hang in the air, reinforcing the finality of the exposure." Rachel, seeing her influence crumble, shifted tactics desperately. She accused me of trying to humiliate her, of twisting things out of context, of being petty. But the evidence was comprehensive, organized, and undeniable. Each accusation she made only highlighted her own lack of credibility. She tried to cry, to appeal to sympathy, but the careful planning, the calm demeanor, and the presence of witnesses made it impossible for her to manipulate the narrative. As the dinner progressed, the atmosphere shifted decisively. Rachel's usual supporters, friends she had casually charmed over the years, began to distance themselves, murmuring quietly among themselves, no longer able to ignore the reality before them. The guests who had respected me now looked at Rachel with a mixture of shock and understanding, seeing the pattern I had endured for years laid bare. Mom sat in stunned silence, visibly processing how the past had been distorted and how her own inaction had contributed to the imbalance. By the end of the evening, Rachel was defeated in a way that was both satisfying and complete. She left the table abruptly, refusing to meet anyone's gaze, muttering about leaving early. Mom followed shortly after, her expression a mixture of guilt and newfound awareness, finally recognizing the consequences of her silence. I remained, quietly collecting my things, letting the gravity of the moment settle over everyone else. There were no dramatic confrontations, no shouting matches, just a calm, undeniable truth that had been revealed, and a shift in the dynamic that would endure far longer than any argument could. Later, after the event, several guests approached me privately, praising my composure, intelligence, and the methodical way I had handled the situation. They expressed admiration for my patience, my strategy, and the courage it took to confront a manipulative family member in a public yet controlled setting. It wasn't revenge for revenge's sake. It was justice, clarity, and self-preservation, executed with precision and restraint. Rachel, in the aftermath, attempted to reconcile and reassert herself, but the dynamic had irrevocably shifted. Her words now fell on ears that were no longer captive to her manipulations. Mom, too, had changed, finally aware of her own role in enabling behavior that had harmed me for years. While the family bond was complicated and the path forward would not be without tension, the balance had been corrected. For the first time, I felt empowered, unshackled, and respected. The most remarkable feeling wasn't triumph over Rachel. It was the recognition of my own resilience. I had been underestimated, manipulated, and minimized for years, yet I had turned the circumstances into a foundation for strength, independence, and self-worth. The power of calm, strategic action had replaced the years of frustration, and I now knew that nothing, Not manipulation, entitlement, or favoritism could take that away from me. That night, as I returned home alone, I paused at the door and looked back at the house, the place that had been both battleground and proving ground. I realized something profound. Victory wasn't about crushing my sister or proving her wrong. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my narrative in a way that could never be denied. I felt a quiet, steady satisfaction, a sense of closure and triumph that was both deep and unshakable. And as I turned off the lights and closed the door behind me, I whispered to myself, with a calm certainty that had been forged through months of struggle and strategy, "This is mine."